Good evening. I'm Vanessa Clough, and I serve as the Director of Alumni Relations for the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences. On behalf of the college, thank you for joining us tonight. Because we are unable to offer in-person events at this time, we hope to provide our alumni and friends a chance to hear from faculty experts through our Food for Thoughts live streaming series. We trust this opportunity will inspire you to explore new topics or performances, reconnect with a favorite professor, or simply revisit the academic experience without the stress of papers or exams. This evening's featured presenter is Rebecca Spang, a professor of history and director of the Liberal Arts and Management program, or better known as LAMP, here in the college at Indiana University. Her first book, The Invention of Restaurants, Paris and the Modern Gastronomic Culture, was recently republished in a special 20th anniversary edition with a new preface by the author and a foreword by Adam Gopnik. Professor Spang has written about contemporary restaurant culture for The Atlantic, The Conversation, and the Times Literary Supplement. Following her presentation, she will be joined by her colleague, Carl Ibsen, as we take your questions. Professor Ibsen is a historian whose work focuses on modern Italy. Additionally, he's the director of the IU Food Institute, which has been partnering with IU Dining during the COVID-19 pandemic to tackle food insecurity on campus and in the local community. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's presentation. Simply click the questions tab at the bottom of your screen. Now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Rebecca Spang.
Hello. Am I visible? Am I audible? I certainly hope so. So what I need to do now is to get my slides up here. So give me a second while we make sure that this happens the way it's supposed to. All right. If my slides are not visible, I hope that Vanessa will let me know. This is a strange format where I really don't know what you're seeing. As Vanessa said, I'm a professor here in Bloomington in the history department, and I also wear quite a few other metaphorical hats. The one that is most important right now is as director of LAMP. I also direct a graduate program in 18th century studies, and I've spent a lot of time being involved with faculty governance. I came to IU almost 15 years ago now from UCL, University College London, and it was, I'll admit, it was a little hard to leave Bloomsbury, to leave the easy Eurostar to Paris, but I jumped at the chance to take a position at IU because, as some of you may know, my mother, oh dear, this may be the problem. My slides won't advance. No, we've got an issue here. It's not, I hope, a terrible one. There we go. My mother, excuse me, my mother was an alumna of IU. I don't have that sweatshirt, sadly. So I'm really happy to be at IU, and I'm really happy to talk to you. I'm very happy that I have the chance to teach students like my mother, first generation college students from Indiana, and also students who come to Bloomington from all over the world. And I hope, perhaps not this evening, but at some other time, I'd be very happy to talk to you by email or telephone, even printed out letter, handwritten letter about any of the courses I teach regularly, such as the French Revolution and Napoleon, the history of money, or the seminar I teach for the LAMP Honors Program, Luxury from Mortal Sin to Market Sector. Today, though, we're going to talk, as Vanessa said, about my first book, The Invention of the Restaurant. So when that book first came out 20 years ago, and well, obviously I must have been, what, 18 when it was published? When that book was published, I really felt that I was writing about something that everybody assumed didn't have to be invented. Right? And in fact, people said that. They were like, what do you mean? Haven't there always been restaurants? Haven't people always been hungry? So the point of the book was to take something that people took for granted and say it has a history, it has a past. Now I worry a little bit that 20 years from now, writing about restaurants will seem as strange and foreign as writing about, oh, I don't know, the Pony Express or medieval religious traditions. But we can hope that won't be the case. Even just in January, when the second edition of the book came out, which was just a few months ago, though, boy, it does feel like another lifetime ago, doesn't it? Even just for the second edition, both in my preface and the foreword that the New Yorker's Adam Gopnik so kindly agreed to write, we both realized that there had been significant changes in restaurants from 20 years ago. Right? So a whole host of things, right? So whether you're thinking about the food channel, celebrity chefs, open plan kitchens, which I suppose are in a way the physical manifestation of the same logic of those other two. All of that meant that restaurants weren't so much about mystery and quiet seduction as they were, well, really about a kind of pseudo swashbuckling, all heat and fire and cursing. Something had really changed in restaurants over the course of the past 20 years. But it seemed that there was an insatiable appetite for swashbuckling and heat and fire. And then, of course, COVID-19 happened. And even before states, quote unquote, locked down, customers in many cities started staying home. I don't know if any of you have seen this graph. It's reservations made on Open Table, and obviously that's not every meal eaten out in the country, but it's quite extraordinary, right? So these are year-on-year changes. So see, by, at the 5th of March, reservations were actually up in Boston over a previous year. By the 10th, they're down, and by the 17th, they'd gone to zero, right? And you see that pattern, well, everywhere. So customers have left restaurants, and by and large, it seems they're staying away. So some of the finest restaurants in the country are now, desperately trying to pay the bills, pay the workers, pay the rent, pay the utilities by doing takeout of various kinds. So what I thought we might do for the next 20 minutes or so is I will talk about where restaurants came from in the first place and see if that gives us hope or inspiration. I don't know if there are any restaurateurs listening to this. I would be delighted if there are. Gives it any hope or inspiration for thinking about what restaurants might do next. Because after all, a lot has changed since the first self-styled restaurateurs opened their doors in Paris in the 1760s. And restaurants have changed as well. So perhaps they can adapt again. So let's think about that and see what we find. Well, but what does it mean in the first place for me to have written a book with the extraordinary title, The Invention of the Restaurant? It certainly doesn't mean that before March 1767, everybody ate at home. In fact, any poor person, most working people living in an urban setting would have never eaten, quote unquote, at home, because their home would have been barely a room or two, maybe a fireplace, certainly no way to cook what we would consider a meal. So for poor and working class people in a city like Paris, eating out was pretty much the norm, right? They ate in the street, they bought things from street vendors, sometimes they went to taverns, if they were traveling, maybe they stopped in an inn. So there were all sorts of ways that people ate out before restaurants. I'm talking mainly here, of course, about an urban setting. It's going to be very different in the countryside. And of course, in Europe in the 18th century, every country was majority agricultural. Even Great Britain doesn't become predominantly urban until the second half of the 19th century. But so there were lots of ways in which people ate that was not eating at home, but it wasn't a restaurant. Another interesting part of this is that actually designated rooms for dining in private houses, right? I mean, haven't dining rooms always existed, at least in wealthy people's houses? Well, no, they're also an invention of this late 17th, early 18th century period. And they were really a high-end specialty, sort of, I suppose, like having a heated swimming pool or something in the 20th century. So here are two designs for a Gothic and a Chinese dining room from an architecture book published in Paris in 1777. So why would it have been actually that in the 1760s and 1770s, when the wealthy people who can afford to go to restaurants for the first time are actually building these elaborate dining rooms in their Paris hotel, why would they then have decided to go out to eat? How did going out to eat become an enjoyable leisure activity for people who had kitchens, and more importantly, people who had servants? This isn't about, oh, I don't feel like cooking tonight, dear. So let's think about the word restaurant. Like, why are restaurants called restaurants anyway? Notice that the word restaurant comes from a French verb, se restaurer, which means to restore or to refresh. And as you see, it's a version of the word restaurant that's used to refer to a particular kind of eating establishment, pretty much in every European language today, with the exception of German. So as an institution, a public eatery with separate tables, right? So in that, it's more like a cafe than an inn or a tavern, and where diners choose their own meals from a menu. And so that's unlike a caterer's menu. A caterer's menu tells you this is what you're going to eat. Very different sense of what a menu is for. So as that particular configuration spread across Europe and the world, some of that specificity of the word restaurer, it got lost. So if we look at a few 18th century examples, what we're going to find is that the word restaurer, it means to restore, it means to refresh, but perhaps strangely for us, it doesn't mean to nourish. Nourishment was not the same as restoration. So I wanted to show you an excerpt, a translation from the earliest advertisement for a restaurant that I found. And when I found this, sitting in the old Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, I was just so delighted and thrilled because I really didn't think I was going to be able to find something like this. So it came from basically a trend-chasing weekly periodical called The Forerunner, L'Avant-Coureur, published in March 1767. It's a much longer ad, but I've just pulled out a few of the significant bits of it. So this very first restaurateur, he's one of the first two or three to have called himself that in Paris. And he says, we shall serve, and at a modest price, only those dishes that contribute to the preservation or restoration of good health. For those who suffer from weak and delicate chests, and whose diets therefore do not usually include an evening meal, it will be convenient to have some decent place where they can go both to enjoy the benefits of society and to take their restaurant or consommé. Notice that this advertisement particularly addresses people whose Quote, diets do not usually include an evening meal. Restaurants are places where people go because they do not eat. And notice that it also says that the restaurateur is going to specialize in dishes that contribute to the preservation or restoration of good health. As I sometimes say, the first restaurants were also the first health food restaurants. And central to their menus were the restorative broths, the soups, the consommés, known at the time as restaurants. So you may remember a few years ago, there was a real fad for bone broth, and it's still very widely available today. That's really what the first restaurateurs were serving. So how could this be a viable business? Before you jump to the conclusion that the 1760s were experiencing an epidemic only slightly less awful than the one we endure today, let's think a little bit more about the phrasing at the start of the second paragraph. Weak and delicate chests. So what does that mean? Well, I spent a long time. It's a funny thing when you're researching a book, you think you know what you're looking for, and then you find something like this ad and you realize you have no idea actually what you're studying. So having started out to write a book about restaurants, or really my PhD dissertation, then suddenly I spent 2 months calling up old medical books and trying to figure out, well, what is weakness of chest? Weakness of chest in the 18th century was a very, very common diagnosis. And it could be anything or nothing. So it might mean what we would today call asthma, hay fever, allergies. Allergies is a really late diagnosis. It's not a concept until the 20th century. Weakness of chest could also be something rather more ominous, consumption, tuberculosis, maybe pneumonia. But most importantly, most generally, what weakness of chest was a signifier, so a marker, a symptom of being sensitive. And sensitivity in elite 18th century European culture was a very, very good thing indeed. Historians of medicine will tell you that the 18th century basically discovered nerves. In the 1960s, in fact, noted intellectual historian Peter Gay described the entire phenomenon of the Enlightenment as, quote unquote, a recovery of nerve. He meant after the multiple crises that beset the 17th century. And other scholars since then have explored how the culture of sensibility pervaded the 18th century in domains from art and architecture to child rearing, medicine, even politics. My colleague Sarah Knott in the history department, her first book is about sensibility in the politics of the American Revolution. I mentioned art, and the image that you have on the screen. This is Jean-Baptiste Greuze. He's an 18th century French painter. This young woman is what is known to art historians as a Greuze girl. It's a type. Greuze painted them, and then lots of other people painted them. What the Greuze girl does is that she emotes in such a way that the viewer is probably more interested in her than in whatever it is that she's emoting about. You will notice, however, that she is very upset about her dead pet bird. So the sensitivity, sensibilité in French, that was such an important virtue in 18th century elite culture, it could manifest itself in various ways. You could weep like a Greuze girl. You might faint. The whole admiring of ruins, right? So going on the grand tour to Italy to see the ruins of the Roman Empire. You might admire sunsets. But another way to indicate how sensitive you were was that you did not eat an evening meal. for those of weak and delicate chests who do not usually eat an evening meal, that must mean you're sensitive. And if you're sensitive, that means that your nerves are finely attuned to the world around you, not like some coarse peasant. So not being able to eat an evening meal as a sign of sensibilité became a sort of cultural marker, as this quotation I have here from this satiric guidebook from 1788 suggests. So, I mean, that was sort of a cultural fad, and it came and then it went again. There's actually a lot of very interesting historical work on how emotions and the manifestation of emotions has changed historically across time. But what made restaurants of enduring popularity long after the culture of sensibility in its 18th century form had faded was both what they served and how they served it. So now we obviously don't have any photographs from the restaurants of the 18th century. And the earliest menus I've found are from right after the French Revolution, but on the basis of probate inventories and other descriptions, we do know something of what the first restaurants looked like. So chez Vaucanson, on the Rue de Grenelle Saint-Honoré, that doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished in the Haussmannisation of Paris. We know that it was mirrored, and mirrors in the 18th century are a major investment. Barometer, thermometer, clock, landscape paintings. So what we're seeing here is a decor that's very attuned to nature and to its scientific measurement. So as we think about how mandatory temperature taking for people going into a public place today may become a new norm, perhaps we can think of ways to use a thermometer like this 18th century one. Now the menu served by Vaucanson is, I suppose, what is today generally called breakfast for dinner. Right? Notice eggs, porridge, rice cream, fruit, wine, water from the king's wells. What's particularly important, I think, is that none of those dishes would have taken very long to prepare except for the bouillons that gave the restaurateur the name of his business in the first place. So yes, it would be a process of 18, 24, 36 hours to make the consommé, but then it could be kept warm in a hot water bath, in a bain-marie, and everything else could be quickly prepared whenever it was called for. And since the whole thing was premised on the importance of restoring health and appetites, the service was individualized. Whereas innkeepers and caterers tended to put all the food on the table at once, family style, something that we are, of course, now being warned against as a possible vector of contagion, restaurateurs individualized. One sensible patron, sensible patron, might need rice pudding, another chicken bouillon. It was this individualization of service, the making individuality and personal attention something that anybody could have, regardless of whether they were an aristocrat or a commoner, regardless actually also of whether they were male or female. Women have been in restaurants from the beginning. That made restaurants really special and quite distinct, really, from the more crowded scene of a coffee house, such as the image you see on the screen now. Now, granted, this individual attention always came at a price, and it was a price that many people could not afford. But as the decades passed and restaurateurs' menus expanded and changed, well, and they did that very quickly, because after all, once your appetite has been restored, maybe a few oysters would be tasty. And then, well, after you've had the oysters, maybe maybe a cutlet wouldn't go down so badly after all. But it's the form of service that remains and really endured for 200 years. Restaurants were public spaces where people went more or less to be private, to be treated as individuals, to sit at quote unquote their own tables, to have their own meals and talk to their own companions. Claiming a seat at one of those tables was to claim an individuality that equaled anybody else's. So as to claim membership in society. Think, for instance, of the importance of lunch counter sit-ins to the civil rights movement. So what might that little history suggest about the future? Well, historians don't like predicting the future because we know it is contingent. That means that it depends on the actions and choices made by people, either as individuals or as collectivities. History depends on human action. It doesn't, despite what people so often say, repeat itself, and it doesn't even rhyme. So for those reasons, I'm a little hesitant to tell you what the future holds. But historians are also people who are pretty good at analyzing patterns. So let's look at a few of those really quickly today. So let's look at the shape of the US restaurant industry right now. And what's striking from this, so first, you may or may not know that for the first time in 2016, consumer spending in restaurants was greater than in grocery stores, which is something I find unimaginable, frankly. You will notice that in 2019, so just last year, there were slightly under 200,000 single location full service restaurants. So that means it's not a chain, it has table service, it might or might not have an alcohol license. And they employed about 3 million people. At that same time, so again, last year, there were more than 1 million restaurants overall in the United States, employing nearly 16 million people. So what that means is that roughly 80% of the restaurants and restaurant jobs in the United States today are chains and or fast food. Now the National Restaurant Association says that 70% of restaurants are single unit operations. So that seems a little confusing until you realize, of course, that the model of McDonald's and so many other chains is that they sell franchises or they lease franchises. So if a franchise owner simply has a single unit, and most do, then it becomes a single unit operation. But most restaurants in the United States are part of a chain. So are the chains going to be hurt by the pandemic we are currently enduring? There's some evidence that they are. All right. So Steak and Shake sales are off 40%, and they've announced that they're going to close roughly 1/10 of their 550 locations. Potbelly sandwiches, their sales are off more like 70%, and they're closing about 100 places. Worldwide, McDonald's sales are down 22% globally in the first quarter, and Starbucks even expects its second quarter earnings to be off by 46%. All of these establishments have been hurt, and I think they've chiefly been hurt because these are places where people go for lunch, they're places people go on their way to and from work, and if people are not going to work, if they are working remotely, they are less likely to be stopping and getting coffee at Starbucks. So obviously, or I imagine obviously, when you think of the word restaurant and historian of 18th and 19th century France, such as myself, you didn't expect me to be talking about Steak and Shake, Potbellies, or Starbucks. But they are in the category restaurants in the United States today, and crucially, they employ a lot of people. And you may or may not know that of the 700,000 people who lost their jobs in the last 2 weeks of March alone, more than 60% of those were in the food and drink trades. So as that trend continues, and of course, unemployment is right now higher than it's been since the Depression, and Goldman Sachs today said they expect it to go to 25%. An economist I trust a lot says she wouldn't be surprised if it goes to 30. This is absolutely devastating. And as the people who work in restaurants don't have a job, then they obviously aren't going to be buying things. So the people from whom they would be buying things, the people making those things, the people selling those services are also going to be impacted. So this is problematic. This is something to worry about. Now, the other thing that's particularly striking when we think about the chains is that this is a domain in which it's already, there's already been a trend to automation, and it's a trend that's likely to continue. So you may have seen headlines about Uber Eats piloting drone delivery in San Diego, trials underway in Shanghai. So that had all started before the pandemic, but I think it's just going to accelerate now. So I've got images here of 3 possibilities. We've got the little round guys. I'm sorry, I called them guys, but they're actually named Penny, made by Bear Robotics, a firm founded by somebody who used to be a researcher at Google and then briefly ran his own takeout Korean barbecue restaurant, and then realized that what restaurants really needed was robot delivery. Or these robot delivery mini cars that are being trialed in various locations, one developed by the School of Engineering at the University of Michigan, the other, Starship Technologies, developed in San Francisco by the Danish and Estonian founders of Skype. So these are all, I think, kind of science fiction-y. And to be honest, it was a photo of a robot delivering food to quarantined people in Wuhan, which I saw, gosh, late January, early February, was the point at which I thought, oh no, this is really bad. This is really bad. So this is all quite science fiction-y. And maybe happily, there are some not quite so science fiction-y developments in our future. So here are a couple of them. The internationally famous Inn at Little Washington, which is a Michelin 3-star restaurant in Virginia, announced today that when it reopens, they are going to seat department store mannequins at the tables that will be left empty under the CDC's social distancing guidelines. So that the few patrons who are there will not feel like they're the only ones there. Maybe that'll work. You will notice then there's this other development from a restaurant in Amsterdam where they're experimenting with greenhouses for 2. And that might work in some environments, some contexts. In Hong Kong, the pandemic has been very well controlled, but all restaurants must now take the temperature of everybody entering. Everybody entering has to fill out and sign a health notice in which they say that they haven't been in contact with anybody who has the virus in the past 2 weeks. They haven't been out of Hong Kong. They don't have various symptoms, and they have to give all their contact details so that they can be found if something were to manifest itself among somebody else who had been in the restaurant at the same time. The restaurants now all provide bags for face masks, hand sanitizer packages. To me, this all seems anything other than reassuring or welcoming. But perhaps in a few years' time, these will seem just as normal parts of restaurant service as salt and pepper, knives and forks. There is, however, and I'm going to end on this, one other trend that I find more cheering. We have seen restaurateurs known for incredibly complicated gastronomy shift to making sort of Julia Child style comfort food for curbside pickup. And even more heartening is the way in which other celebrity chefs, like the three I show you here, have shown a renewed sense of cuisine and cookery as social arts, part of what builds society. So Daniel Hum from 11 Madison Park and Ree Mazil in San Francisco, his restaurant has sometimes been called the best in the world. Her bakery is very highly thought of. They have converted their kitchens to feed essential workers and people experiencing food insecurity. Aaron Adams in Portland, the third figure you see on the slide, says that when and if his Farm Spirit restaurant ever reopens, the 10-course tasting menu aimed at well-heeled tourists will be a thing of the past. I'm quoting him, quote, "It would be insane to stay the same. And frankly, I'm looking forward to a change." After seeing all this, by which he means both the pandemic itself and the economic effects, after seeing all this, quote, "how precarious everything is, how can I go on with a restaurant that only feeds, quote unquote, people of means? If I did that, I wouldn't have a conscience. I wouldn't feel good about it." So I find that a really heartening development. And perhaps it was not for nothing, after all, that the 18th century self-styled inventor of restaurants, Mathurin Rose de Chantoiseau, often signed himself the friend of all the world. Thank you.
Okay, I'm working on this. Hey, Rebecca.
Hey,
Thanks.
girl.
That was great. I really enjoyed it. Some of it I've heard before, and obviously some I haven't. Hello, everyone. My name is Carl Ipsen. I am a colleague of Rebecca's in the history department. My connections with IU are a little different. I do not have any parents who went here. In fact, when I came for my job interview in January of 1994, which was a very cold month, I had never been in the Midwest before. I'm from the coast. And here we are 26 years later from Bloomington. So obviously something was right about that. It's a pleasure to be here. As Vanessa mentioned before, I'm the director of the Food Institute, which is a bit of a change in career for me, and it's also a return because I worked in restaurants for a decade in the Bay Area in the 1980s and maintain connections there. I'm the moderator. As such, I have the privilege of asking the first question. And this may be it's one of those sort of academic questions, I guess. And then I want to talk a little bit about some developments that are interesting to me and that I've been thinking about lately, especially since I was asked to be moderator for this event. So another commonplace that people assign to history is that people study history so that we can learn from the past. And I don't really subscribe to that very much. I think much of what's taken from the past in that regard is pretty negative, actually, and fuels developments like nationalism and based on historic precedent that really we'd probably be better without. I think history we can study for its own sake without worrying about the lessons that we get from it. But what I'm struck by in this past month is the lessons that historians can maybe learn from the present in rethinking the past. And this is when I'm thinking a little bit about the 18th century, this is what comes out of it, right? We're in a moment when there's a respiratory disease that has spread around the world that's radically changed the way we live. Hopefully in the short term, but some things surely are going to change in the long term. And I join Rebecca in hesitating to predict the future and what's going to stick and what isn't. But even the comments of the restaurateur that you mentioned suggest, yeah, things are going to be different, and not only for restaurants. But once upon a time, for example, the 18th century, and Rebecca knows way more about the 18th century than I do, respiratory illnesses were frequent, were endemic, right? Tuberculosis, smallpox, diphtheria, others existed throughout Europe and were endemic, and people suffered from those.
Right.
And I have to ask myself, and this is where I think the present can talk to the historian, maybe other people have thought about this, but when I think now about the 18th century, I wonder, what did people do? That risk was there. The risk of getting smallpox or tuberculosis was there. So did people think twice before going into public places, before, going into a theater? Theaters were around long before restaurants. Because of these risks, obviously the diseases weren't well understood, but clearly they were more frequent in cities. They were more frequent where people gathered. So there was enough of an understanding to realize that you could be safer if you, and there was isolation, there was quarantine, and not only for plague, to deal with these diseases. Now, I'm also a demographer. I have an MA in demography. I do know that mortality in Europe, the so-called demographic transition, starts in the late 18th century. Mortality starts to come down. I mean, this is a bit far-fetched, but there are two parts of the question. Is there any way we can link the emergence of the restaurant to a feeling like we can gather more safely? Because in the 1780s, you could.
Yeah.
It was marginally. And what does that tell us about the present day? Because chances are we're not going to stay on lockdown forever. In fact, we're probably not going to stay on lockdown until we've eliminated COVID-19, although it would be wonderful if we did eliminate it. So are people going to start to view going out, like, measured, balancing the risk? Is it worth it? Maybe I should go to a restaurant because, well, it's, maybe it'll work.
Right. So I think there are a couple things that come to mind in response to that. One is that if you think about the really devastating epidemics in France in the 18th, 19th century, right? So there's plague in 1720 in Marseille, and it kills more than half the population. But that's the last time there's plague in France. And then cholera comes for the first time in 1832 and spreads really rapidly through Paris, but it's waterborne. So it stays like where particular sources of water are. In between, as you say, yes, there's the demographic transition where suddenly more people are being born and living through babyhood and fewer people are dying. And I think what's really going on there is part of the general increase in prosperity that we might call part of the industrious or the industrial revolution in the 18th century. And that part of that is a sort of renewed optimism, what Peter Gay called the recovery of nerve in the Enlightenment, that makes it possible to think, as the founder of restaurants did, that circulation, people moving around, could be actually a benefit, right? A sort of 18th century version of globalization. And I think some of Rose de Chantoiseau's faith and trust in circulation and commerce has carried on for, again, a good 250 years. And we are just now coming to a point where suddenly we distrust a whole lot of things that seemed pretty obviously to be good. So I don't know if we're at a complete inflection point and we're going to go back into some sort of 17th century crisis. I certainly hope not. But I think you may be right that for some people at least, and we obviously see that people are calculating risks very differently. right? I mean, if you look at people across the country, or even just in Bloomington, I mean, there were obviously graduation parties going on this weekend.
There were. Okay, we've got a series of questions here,
Mhm.
and I'm going to ask you a few of them. I don't know if we have time for all of them, and some of them I think came early, and you anticipated them with some of the things you said. So apologies to those whom I might not get to. Hadassah Weiner, I hope I got that pronunciation right. There's I know people who pronounce that name 3 different ways. Asks, the description of sensibilité sounds almost romantic. Does development of restaurants coincide with the transition from Enlightenment to Romanticism?
Yes, I think that's a really important point. And in fact, the philosophe, or rather the anti-philosophe, who figures most prominently in my book is Rousseau, who is usually considered that linchpin figure between Enlightenment and Romanticism. So yes, I think that's a very astute observation. And that sense of individual artistry, which is of course so important for Romantic poetry, Romantic art, Romantic music, is very much, again, part of that ideal of the individual and the personality that is so central to restaurants and to the idea of taste in general.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Things are jumping around a little bit here. Well, here's one. We actually anticipated this. Wonderful presentation. This is Jacob Hagstrom. Rebecca, you mentioned some big chains that have reported dramatically lower sales. No, I'm sorry, this is a new question. Reported dramatically lower sales. Are there other restaurants that have adapted well to the takeout and delivery? Is takeout restaurant an oxymoron?
Right. Well, so for instance, I mentioned, and in fact, he was on the second slide, the man standing there in the, what I think of as the post-Bourdain pirate pose. Carl's adopting it a little bit right now. That's Grant Ashat from Chicago, who, his restaurant Alinea, it was the molecular gastronomy capital, certainly of the Midwest, right? So famous for sugar balloons filled with helium, and for other really complicated bits of culinary chemistry and very spectacularly staged meals. So that's what his restaurant was famous for, and it was, $400, and you had to get reservations 6 months in advance. And within a week of Chicago shutting down, he was doing 300 meals a night of coq au vin and mousse au chocolat. So he really converted to, again, sort of old school Julia Child comfort food, and is now making 75% of the revenue that he did before the pandemic. So he's found a way to do it, and some other celebrity chefs have, I think, managed to parlay name recognition into a sustained source of income. What worries me are the small restaurants. So we'll think of something like Samira's in Bloomington. Think of any restaurant run, by a family that doesn't have name recognition, where people aren't going to be tweeting, "Oh, I ordered this for my wife's birthday." They're hurting, and it's not clear they're going to bounce back.
Okay. Jumping around, but here's a question from my friend Tim Riffle, who reminds us that he's a BA 1980 from IU. We eat out for entertainment a lot. We're less worried about commodity dining. Who cares whether takeout or eat in, as opposed to fine dining in elegant settings? Which will recover first? I disagree with the doomsayers. I think that fine dining will be the first to recover. People miss the experience.
I think people do miss the experience. And I think the question is whether somebody running a fine dining establishment can possibly make enough money if only 30% of the tables have anybody sitting at them because of CDC social distancing guidelines. So maybe the way you do that is you increase the prices threefold, and people are so desperately eager to go out to eat that they're willing to do that. Maybe. Or you keep the restaurant open 3 times as long. I don't think that seems very appealing. So it's about making the business model work, because I think you're right. I think people really do crave the experience.
Yeah, and there's a indication that people are getting a little bit fed up with lockdown and trying to find other solutions. I know I read that Bloomington's talking about closing streets so restaurants can put tables outside.
Yeah.
Which will work for the summer.
Right.
But then
Right. Right. I mean, there seems to be a lot of indication that a vector of contagion is airflow in any sort of centrally heated or centrally air-conditioned building. So yes, what a shame that we just put that into Valentine.
Yeah. Here's a question that's going to push you a little out of your comfort zone from Jim Tang. Hi, Rebecca. Today you are talking about the invention of restaurants mainly in Western culture, influenced by the sensitivity culture of the 18th century. So how about the invention of restaurants in other cultures? For example, Asian cultures. Do they invent the concept of restaurants independently within their cultures? Or do they just borrow the idea and lifestyle of dining in restaurants from the Western culture? Thanks.
Well, this I know only from having been a guest on several programs where somebody else was an expert in that. And so I know that in what is now China, in the early Ming or slightly before that, so 13th century by European calculations, there certainly were banqueting facilities that had what I would consider to be many of the characteristics of a restaurant, chiefly that people ordered their meals from a menu, and that service was individualized. So no, there's a very long history there that's quite independent. What I've also seen some very interesting articles on just very recently is the phenomenon that many people associate with Chinese restaurants of sharing food, now possibly being something that again will be considered a vector of contagion. And so in China right now, there is a very big push to introduce serving chopsticks, which I'm told in China itself is not normal, but is much more common in Japan or Taiwan.
Huh, interesting, okay. We've got about 5 more minutes. Here's a question from Anthony Nelson. Were there similar economic consequences to the food industry during other crises frequently compared to the current pandemic, such as Spanish flu, Great Depression, 2008 recession, etc.?
Okay, this is a really great question, and I was trying to figure out how to work this in, so thank you for asking. The fascinating thing about the 1918 H1N1 pandemic, the thing that's called the Spanish flu, is that in many cities, they closed the schools, they closed the churches, they closed government offices sometimes, businesses were shut, bars were shut, restaurants never shut. So St. Louis and Philadelphia, there's an article in the Washington Post many people have read about how those 2 cities responded very differently to the crisis. And so all the hospital beds in Philadelphia are immediately taken, and St. Louis has a much flatter curve. Neither place do they shut restaurants. And the reason is that there are far fewer restaurants in early 20th century United States than there are today, but they're not part of entertainment. They are an essential place for city dwellers who lived in boarding houses or in a 1-room studio flat. It was the essential place where they went to get their meals. So there was a sense that you would be kicking important workers out of a place to get food if you close the restaurants. So the restaurants don't close. What really transforms restaurants in the aftermath of that epidemic and the aftermath of World War I isn't the epidemic itself. It is, of course, prohibition, which shut down a lot of restaurants and did really transform restaurant culture and nightlife in general in the 1920s and early 1930s.
Interesting. Well, I think that's a really interesting response. I wasn't aware of that. U.S. story after the Spanish flu in World War I. But I think it's linked actually to this question from Karen Bush, which may be our last. In Bloomington, it appears Dairy Queen has been doing a booming drive-through business. Are there other restaurants that have capitalized on our takeout requirements? And I think you might make the argument that drive-through today serves in some ways the function that restaurants may have in St. Louis and Philadelphia in 1919.
I think that's right. I haven't been out and about a lot, but when we have, for instance, gone to Brown County to go for a hike or whatever, it seems every time we drive past the Chick-fil-A, there is a very long line of people.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I think takeout and drive-through, though again, Steak and Shake has drive-through, but they're just losing too much dining room patronage. So again, I don't know if there are some chains that always had more drive-through business than they had dining room. But yeah, drive-through is certainly a big part of it.
Okay, excellent. You know, going back to the beginning, and we're just about out of time. You know, the weakness of chest it also made me think again about respiratory diseases, and something that we're facing today.
Yeah.
If restaurants, if the first restaurants were health food restaurants, you know, how can we mold the image of restaurants that they're somehow going to provide us a way out?
Right.
Of the pandemic.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. Right. So if you think about the things that look a little bit frightening from the restaurants in Hong Kong today, that everybody has to have their temperature taken, if you could somehow like build that back into an 18th century culture of sensibility, right? That this is, and I think the key thing, and it's so hard right now, but we have to somehow learn to trust people again, instead of every time we see a fellow human being think, oh no, could be carrying the virus. And on the other hand, we have to stay away from them, right? So, and in a sense, of course, restaurants have always been about, you know, trusting people enough to have them sitting at the next table, and on the other hand, not talking to them. Right? I mean, it's very rare in a restaurant that somebody turns to somebody at another table that they've never met and says, is that good? Did you like it? Can I taste it? And so it's right? I mean, why don't people do that? It's about the social norms that have developed about how we inhabit this shared space. So if we can find new ways of inhabiting shared spaces without spreading the virus, that will be an extremely important accomplishment, I think.
The individual greenhouses in Bloomington summers are not going to work.
That seems a little toasty. I'm not sure I think that's a very good idea. It might work this week, but not much later.
In some climates it would.
Yeah.
So look, we've come, it's 8 o'clock, so this is our appointed end time. Rebecca, this has been wonderful. I thank you. I think I thank you on behalf of the other
I've enjoyed it enormously.
There are more questions that I think you can go look at and find the ones that I didn't get to.
Oh, okay.
And maybe you can respond to them.
Okay, great.
But Vanessa's probably lurking in the background. I don't know if she wants to make a final comment before we close. This is our end. So thank you. And
right. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl, and thank you so much, Rebecca. We appreciate everyone joining us and taking time out of your schedules this evening to participate in this live streaming event. Again, I would like to personally thank Professor Spang for her excellent presentation and Professor Ibsen for moderating tonight's questions. We are grateful to you both. Finally, events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund.